The moment I knew my son no longer deserved his father's legacy wasn't when Richard drew his final breath after an 8-month battle with cancer. It wasn't during our 45 years of marriage while he built Mitchell Shipping from nothing and Thomas spent freely without understanding sacrifice. It was when I stood alone beside my husband's mahogany casket, rain pelting the green canopy of the cemetery, staring at the empty chair where our only son should have been. He said he'd try to make it back for the burial. Mrs. Mitchell whispered, Jennifer Richards' executive assistant of 20 years, her eyes red-rimmed as she squeezed my hand. Something about Victoria's birthday celebration running long. A birthday celebration. While his father, the man who had given him everything, was being lowered into the cold Chicago earth. I nodded, keeping my face a mask of dignity, despite the hurricane of rage inside me. The funeral director looked at me questioningly, wondering whether we should wait. Around us, hundreds of Richard's employees and friends shifted uncomfortably, witnesses to a son's final insult to his father. Begin, I said, my voice didn't shake. As the pastor's words blurred through my grief, I drifted to our last conversation. Richard's frame had been diminished by disease, but his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence that built his empire. He's not ready for it, Ellie, he'd said hoarsely. He's 42 years old. I argued, the same old defense rising from habit, not conviction. He'll step up when the time comes. Richard laughed, a dry, painful sound. That's why I've made provisions. The final choice will be yours. You'll know what to do. Now, as his casket descended without Thomas there to say goodbye, I finally understood what Richard had meant. The reception at our Lakeshore Drive penthouse was a somber affair. Associates murmured stories of Richard's brilliance and generosity, while I drifted among them like a ghost, my phone silent in my hand. 4 hours after the funeral ended, the elevator chimed. Thomas strode in his designer suit, immaculate Victoria clinging to his arm in a dress far too festive for mourning. Mother, he said coolly, kissing my cheek. Sorry we couldn't stay longer at the service. Victoria's party had been planned for months, you understand. I looked at my son Richard's golden boy with his father's jaw, but none of his substance, and saw him clearly for the first time. The reading of the will is tomorrow at 10, I said, my voice stripped of warmth. Richard's attorney insists all beneficiaries be present. Thomas lowered his voice conspiratorially. Victoria and I were hoping to fly to Aspen tonight. Can't we handle the formalities next week? Gasps rippled through the room. No, Thomas, be there or the consequences will be significant. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He had never heard that tone from his doting mother before. Later that night, I opened the safe hidden behind Richard's portrait. Inside lay an envelope marked to Eleanor, after the funeral. My dearest Eleanor. The letter began. If you're reading this, then Thomas has shown you who he truly is. I've never wanted to break your heart by saying this, but our son is not the man we raised him to be. The power to ensure he never profits from the father he couldn't be bothered to bury is now yours. You'll make the right decision, you always do. As dawn broke over Lake Michigan, I whispered to the empty room. He'll learn that actions and absences have consequences. At Harrington and Associates, the mahogany-paneled conference room was silent as Richard's attorney began reading the will. Estate valued at approximately $1.2 billion to Thomas Mitchell, son of the deceased, conditional upon the moral character clause. Thomas frowned. What clause? The lawyer read, the bequest to my son is conditional upon my wife Eleanor's sole discretion regarding his conduct during my final days and funeral. Should she deem his behavior disrespectful, negligent, or inappropriate, she may invoke this clause to redirect his inheritance. The blood drained from Thomas's face. Mrs. Mitchell, the attorney asked gently, do you wish to invoke the moral character clause? Every eye turned to me. 42 years of excuses flashed before me, the missed holidays, the selfishness, the empty chair at the funeral. Yes, I said evenly, I invoke it. Thomas leapt to his feet. Mother, you can't be serious. You left your father's funeral for a party, Thomas. It was Victoria's 40th birthday. Guests flew in from Europe. And that mattered more than saying goodbye to your father. The lawyer continued. Under Alternative Distribution Plan, C, 30% to the Richard Mitchell Foundation, 30% to Charlotte Mitchell, 30% to employee pensions, and 10% to Mrs. Mitchell for discretionary use. Victoria's face twisted. This is elder manipulation. The only manipulation, the attorney said calmly, was Mr. Mitchell's careful legal planning. Thomas's voice broke. So I get nothing. 40 years as his son and I get nothing. You received everything a son could want, I said softly. A father who loved you. That was all he ever asked you to honor. He stormed out, vowing revenge. Charlotte, his daughter, remained behind. She took my hand. Grandpa deserved better. I squeezed her fingers. He saw in you what he once hoped to see in your father. As we left the office, I felt both hollow and resolute. Richard had trusted me to make the hardest choice, and I had. For those who've listened this far, please subscribe to see what happens when my son learns that legacy without love is nothing. The week following the will reading unfolded like a slow-burning war, one fueled not by grief but by pride. Thomas called 17 times the first day alone, each message more desperate than the last rage-bargaining threats. "You won't like what happens if you don't fix this," he said in one of them. His voice, once the charming cadence of a businessman, had turned raw and cracking. I didn't answer. I simply listened in silence to every word, each one confirming that Richard had seen our son more clearly than I ever could. On the third day, Victoria appeared at my penthouse unannounced. The doorman apologized, saying she had claimed a family emergency. I found her in the living room, standing by Richard's antique watch collection, her gaze not sentimental, but calculating. "This isn't a good time, Victoria," I said. "It's never a good time to discover you've been disinherited," she replied, tracing her manicured nail along the glass display. "Eleanor, we both know this can be fixed." "Do we?" I asked. "You're upset about the funeral, I understand. Thomas should have stayed longer. I take full responsibility. The party you couldn't postpone despite your father-in-law's death." She waved her hand dismissively. Richard was already gone. The funeral was just a formality. Something in me hardened. I finally understood what Richard had seen in her the first day he met her, the predatory gleam behind the practiced smile. "Victoria, the will reflects Richard's wishes, not mine," I said. Her expression cracked. "Thomas is his only son. Being a son is more than biology. It's about presence, respect, love. Qualities your husband hasn't shown in years." Her voice turned sharp. "We can contest this, drag it through the courts for years if we have to. Is that what you want? Headlines, family laundry on display? If that's the path Thomas chooses, so be it." She picked up her handbag, her tone icy. "You'll regret this. Thomas isn't the only one who can make difficult choices." When she left, silence filled the penthouse like fog. I sat in Richard's old armchair, the one that still smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar, and whispered, "You were right, my love. She's poison in designer shoes." That night, I took out a photo of Thomas as a boy, sitting proudly beside Richard on the bow of his first cargo ship. His smile back then had been pure, untouched by greed or ego. "Where did we lose him?" I murmured. The next morning, Charlotte arrived clutching a pastry box and an anxious expression. "Grandma, I hope it's okay that I came," she said, stepping inside. He's not handling this well." "You're always welcome here, sweetheart," I replied. Over tea, she told me everything, how her father was ranting about betrayal, how Victoria had started talking about selling jewelry and art pieces that weren't even legally theirs. "Victoria says they're cash poor now because of you," Charlotte said bitterly. "Your father makes over $1 million a year," I reminded her. "They're not poor. They're just not richer than they think they deserve to be." Charlotte hesitated before lowering her voice. "They're talking about suing you. Victoria told Dad to claim that Grandpa wasn't in his right mind when he changed the will. She even said you were too grief-stricken to think clearly." I smiled sadly. Of course she did. Charlotte's eyes searched mine. "What do you think I should do?" "Stay out of it, darling," I said softly. "This is between your father and me." But the truth was, it wasn't just between us. It was about the legacy of a man who had built an empire from dust, and whether that legacy would end in ruin because of greed. A week later, Walter Richards' attorney called. "Eleanor," he said gravely, "Thomas filed formal paperwork contesting the will, claims of undue influence and diminished capacity. He's hired Grayson Mills." I recognized the name. Mills was infamous in Chicago legal circles, the kind of lawyer who fed on family blood. "What's your assessment?" I asked. "They don't have much. Richard recorded several legal confirmations of competency, and we have video evidence of him discussing the clause. Still, these cases can turn ugly." "Let them," I replied quietly. "Richard prepared me for this." That evening, Jennifer arrived with an envelope Richard had left for me. He said to give you this only when you need to remember why you're fighting. Inside was a letter and a small storage key. The note simply read, "For when Thomas forces your hand, Storage Unit 447. All my love always." The next morning, I drove to the storage facility, my heart pounding. Inside the unit was only a small television and a video camera. A yellow post-it on the screen said "Press play." Richard's face filled the screen, healthy smiling recorded long before his illness took him. "Hello, my darling Eleanor," he began. "If you're watching this, then Thomas has chosen his path and you've honored my wishes despite the pain." Tears streamed down my face as he continued. For years, I turned away from what I saw. His mismanagement, his absence, the way he used company money for personal gain. I didn't want to believe our son could become the man he has. But I can't leave the company or its people in his hands. You must protect them, Ellie. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for our children is to hold them accountable. When the video ended, I stood there surrounded by silence and whispered to the flickering image on the screen, "I'll protect what you built, Richard, even if it means losing him forever." As I drove back through the cold Chicago dusk, the skyline glowing like embers, I felt a strange strength settle over me. "If you've been following this journey," I said softly, looking out at the lights, "subscribe and stay. Because this fight isn't over. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you fight against your own blood." The legal summons arrived the next day, 56 pages of accusations. Thomas's lawyers claimed I'd manipulated Richard, that I was unstable, that grief had clouded my judgment. Reading it, I felt neither anger nor fear, only exhaustion. I called Walter. "They've gone nuclear," he said grimly. "They're even requesting Richard's medical records and staff depositions." "Let them," I replied. "We have nothing to hide." That night, the first news headline appeared: "Mitchell family feud over billion-dollar empire." Charlotte called in tears. "Dad's giving interviews." "Grandma?" He said, "You've been confused since Grandpa died." "It doesn't surprise me," I said quietly. "Desperation makes people do shameful things." The next morning, Jennifer came again holding a thick folder. "This is from the communications team. Richard had it prepared 6 months ago." Inside were media statements, medical certificates, photos showing Thomas missing from key company events, and a note in Richard's handwriting: "If Thomas makes this public, defend yourself with truth, but never with vengeance." I nodded slowly. "Then we'll wait," I said. "We won't strike first." Jennifer hesitated before handing me another envelope. "He said to give you this only if Thomas attacks your character publicly." Inside was a memory card labeled "The Nuclear Option." I didn't even need to look to know what was on it. Videos, recordings, the kind of proof that could destroy a man. I locked it away, whispering to the air, "Please, Richard, don't let it come to that." But deep down I already knew it would. The lawsuit's first hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Chicago buzzed with gossip like bees around a wound. For decades, Richard Mitchell's name had meant integrity, empire, and endurance. Now it was being dragged into headlines dripping with scandal. Walter insisted I undergo 3 independent psychological evaluations. "All 3 confirm you're perfectly competent," he said. "You're grieving, yes, but clear, rational, and fit. That will help us shut down their argument before it grows teeth." I smiled faintly. Richard always said to prepare for every storm, even the ones your own family starts. Still, the nights were long. I wandered the penthouse like a ghost, unable to sleep in the vast emptiness Richard had left behind. His glasses still lay folded on his nightstand. His old wool sweater, the one he wore every winter morning while drinking coffee and reading the Tribune, still hung in the closet, faintly scented with cedar and aftershave. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I opened a drawer I'd avoided since his death. Inside was a worn leather journal, edges softened by use. Richard's handwriting filled the pages, neat, deliberate, almost architectural. "Thomas missed another board meeting today," one entry read. "Third this quarter. Claimed Victoria needed him for a charity gala. The board is noticing. Worse, Thomas knows they notice, and he's embarrassed. But instead of improving, he lashes out." Page after page chronicled his heartbreak. His fear that his empire, his life's work, might crumble in unworthy hands. And beneath that guilt that we had raised our son with too much comfort and not enough accountability. Then, near the end of the journal, a final entry written 2 weeks before his death. "The hardest part of dying isn't leaving the company or even leaving you, Ellie. It's knowing I won't be here to help Thomas become the man he could still be. That burden now falls to you. By the time I closed the journal, dawn was already touching the lake. Richard had trusted me with more than wealth or reputation. He had trusted me to teach our son what love really meant. That morning I called Charlotte. "Tell your father I want to meet," I said. "No lawyers, no Victoria. Just us." She hesitated. "He'll think it's a trap." "Then tell him it's about a settlement," I said quietly. "He'll come." 2 days later he arrived. He looked older, the first signs of exhaustion replacing the polish he once wore like armor. "Mother," he said stiffly, refusing coffee. "Charlotte said you wanted to discuss terms." I studied him for a moment, searching for the boy I used to rock to sleep when he had nightmares. "I wanted to give you one chance to withdraw the lawsuit before it gets uglier." He laughed sharp and bitter. "Withdraw? You've stolen my birthright." "Your father made a choice, Thomas. I honored it. Because I missed a funeral," he exploded. "One day's mistake and you take away a lifetime's inheritance." "It wasn't one day," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "It was years of days, years of excuses, years of turning away." He sneered. "You can't prove any of that." I leaned forward. "Your father documented everything. Every missed meeting, every inappropriate expense, every conversation where you promised to do better and didn't. He left it all on video." Thomas froze. The color drained from his face. "You're bluffing." Richard was many things, Thomas, but unprepared wasn't one of them. For a brief moment, fear flickered in his eyes. Then arrogance returned, snapping over it like ice. "Release whatever you want. Victoria and I have already given interviews about your fragile mental state. Who do you think people will believe? The confused widow or the son fighting for his legacy?" He turned to go, but I stopped him with one last sentence. "Your father's greatest regret wasn't disinheriting you, Thomas. It was realizing you'd stopped wanting to earn his pride." He said nothing, only slammed the door behind him, leaving silence that vibrated like an aftershock. That night, I sat by the window overlooking the lake, Richard's journal in my lap. "He's chosen war," I whispered, "but I'll fight it your way with truth." And to the invisible audience who had followed me through every heartbreak, I murmured softly, "Don't forget to subscribe if you're still with me. The battle for Richard's legacy is only beginning, and the line between justice and love is about to blur." The courthouse was a circus. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones flashing like lightning. As Walter helped me from the car, voices swarmed. "Mrs. Mitchell, did you manipulate your husband's will? Is it true your son was cut out for missing a funeral? Are you mentally unfit as your son claims?" Walter's arm tightened around me. "No comments until after the hearing," he said firmly. Inside the courtroom was full journalists, lawyers, even former employees. I saw Charlotte in the front row, her face pale but determined. When our eyes met, she gave me a small, brave nod. Thomas entered moments later with Victoria at his side and his lawyer, the infamous Grayson Mills. Thomas's suit was perfectly tailored, but his posture screamed nerves. Victoria wore black, a widow's shade. She had no right to claim a calculated act to sway public sympathy. Judge Patricia Winters, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, called the session to order. "This is a preliminary hearing regarding the Mitchell estate," she began. Mills approached first, smooth as venom. "Your Honor," he said, "this case centers on a grievous injustice. My client, Thomas Mitchell, has been cruelly disinherited through a clause inserted during his father's final illness when Mr. Mitchell was heavily medicated and easily influenced. We intend to show that Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell, driven by grief and resentment, manipulated her dying husband to punish her son for a trivial offense, missing part of a funeral, to attend a family obligation." His voice oozed false sympathy. He gestured toward me. "Mrs. Mitchell's cognitive decline is well documented by witnesses who observed confusion and erratic behavior during her husband's final months." I almost laughed, but Walter placed a steadying hand over mine. When it was his turn, Walter rose calmly, dignified as a priest. "Your Honor, Richard Mitchell was one of the most methodical men in this city. His will was not the product of confusion, but of clarity. The documents before you show 3 crucial truths. Richard was medically certified as competent when he updated his will. The moral character clause was not a last-minute addition, but a reflection of years of concern over his son's conduct. And Mrs. Mitchell's invocation of that clause was not vindictive. It was faithful adherence to her husband's explicit instructions. He let the words settle, then added softly, "This case isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility, a father's right to protect what he built." The courtroom was silent. Then Mills played his card, a video deposition from Thomas's household chef, claiming, "I had once told Richard Thomas doesn't deserve anything you built." Walter stood immediately. "Your Honor, context matters." With the judge's permission, he played a second recording Richard's own video from that same day. In it, I sat by Richard's hospital bed, tears in my eyes. "Thomas doesn't deserve anything you built if he can't even visit you while you're dying," I said. Richard's weak but firm voice replied, "I know, Ellie. I've known for years. I just didn't want to admit it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Thomas's face flushed crimson. Victoria looked away. When the hearing ended, Judge Winters leaned forward. "This case involves more than law. It involves family. I'm ordering mediation before full litigation. Use this chance to repair what can still be repaired." Outside, the media waited like vultures. Thomas, eager to spin the story, rushed to the microphones. "This isn't about greed," he declared. "It's about my father's true wishes being twisted by grief." When it was my turn, I spoke calmly. "This isn't about a missed funeral. It's about honoring a man's legacy built on integrity, something no courtroom can rewrite." Back home, exhaustion washed over me. My phone buzzed. A message from Charlotte. "Dad's desperate." I overheard him and Victoria arguing they're planning to leak Grandpa's medical records, even twist his confusion during chemo into evidence. "Please, Grandma, stop this before it ruins everything." I closed my eyes. "Oh, Richard," I whispered. "You always said pride would be his downfall." Then, turning to the invisible audience that had grown with every chapter of my grief, I said softly, "If you've stayed with me this far, subscribe to see what happens when a family legacy turns into a battlefield. Some wars aren't fought for money, they're fought for the truth." The following week unfolded like a storm that refused to end. Thunder one moment, eerie calm the next, but always with something darker rolling on the horizon. The Chicago Business Herald published a front-page spread, "Billion-Dollar Betrayal, Mitchell Family at War." The article quoted anonymous sources close to Thomas and Victoria, describing me as a grieving widow, emotionally manipulated by her late husband's legal advisors. One line made my breath catch. "Those around Mrs. Mitchell have expressed concern about her fixation on legacy and her declining ability to distinguish memory from motive." It was Victoria's phrasing. I'd heard it before at dinner parties when she'd wanted to sound clever. I set the paper down and whispered into the empty room, "They're not just trying to win the case. They're trying to rewrite who I am." That afternoon, Charlotte arrived, her face pale with worry. "Dad and Victoria are meeting with the PR team that leaked those stories," she said. "They're trying to push Grandpa's medical history next. They think if they paint him as confused near the end, the will won't hold up." I pressed my hands against my temples. "They would destroy his reputation for money." Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. Victoria said, "Dead men can't defend their mental state." It felt like a knife twisting between my ribs. "She's the one driving this," I said quietly. "But your father, he's letting her." Charlotte's voice cracked. "He just keeps saying I have to protect what's mine." "Not what's his," I corrected softly. "What he thinks he deserves." The next morning, I returned to Mitchell Shipping headquarters for the first time since Richard's death. It felt strange walking through those glass doors without him beside me, the man who'd once built this empire on handshake deals and relentless integrity. Now the employees whispered as I passed their eyes a mix of pity and loyalty. In the executive conference room, the current acting CEO, James Woodson, waited with grim news. "Mrs. Mitchell, we have a problem with the Mayer Group," he said. "Their European division is threatening to pull their $140 million contract. They're citing instability at the top due to the ongoing legal dispute." I exhaled slowly. "Instability Thomas himself created." James nodded. "We've just learned he contacted them directly, telling them he'll resume control soon." They're confused and they're losing confidence. The rage I'd kept buried for weeks began to stir. "He's undermining the company to strengthen his case." James looked apologetic. "He's still regional director. Technically, he has access to sensitive information." "Not anymore," I said firmly. "Restrict his access immediately. Richard left me controlling authority for a reason." "That's a significant step," James cautioned. "He'll see it as retaliation." "He can call it whatever he wants," I replied. "I call it protecting my husband's legacy." By noon, security had executed the order. By 2, my phone began ringing Thomas's number again and again. I ignored every call. At 4 o'clock, he showed up in person. The elevator chimed and he strode into Richard's office. My office, now his face, flushed eyes wild. "You locked me out of my own company." "Your father's company," I corrected calmly. "The one you're trying to destabilize." "I built relationships here for years. Relationships you're now weaponizing against the business." Thomas paced, running his hands through his hair, the same gesture Richard used to make when deep in thought, only now it was frantic, not thoughtful. "I'm fighting for what's mine," he said. "No, Thomas," I said softly. "You're fighting for what you feel entitled to. That's not the same." He turned on me, his voice trembling. "You know what Victoria says? That you've always been jealous of me, that you resented how Dad groomed me to take over." I almost laughed. Jealousy. Thomas, your father spent 20 years begging you to care about more than the spotlight. He offered you every chance to learn, but you treated the company like an ATM. That's not true. It's written down, I said quietly. In his journal. Every missed meeting, every disappointment. He didn't stop loving you, Thomas, but love doesn't erase truth. His face contorted. "Stop talking about me like I'm some failure. Then stop behaving like one." The words came out before I could temper them, and for a heartbeat the room went still. Finally, he said, voice breaking, "Dad was proud of me." "He loved you," I said gently. "That's different from pride." Thomas looked away, his jaw clenching, but I saw something flicker there, a fracture, a hint of uncertainty. "Thomas," I said softly, "do you really think Victoria would stay with you if there were no inheritance coming? No title, no prestige?" He spun toward me, anger flaring. "Don't you dare! She's already planning her escape routes. I've seen women like her my entire life. She'll leave when there's nothing left to take." That's a disgusting thing to say. Maybe, but true things often are. He glared, shaking. "You don't know anything about my marriage. I know that before Victoria, you spent Sundays at your father's side. That you used to join us for dinners, birthdays, holidays. And then she arrived and suddenly family became an inconvenience." "That's not fair." "Fair," I laughed softly. "You missed your father's funeral. You don't get to talk about fair." For the first time, Thomas didn't have an answer. He stood there, breathing hard, as if realizing too late the gravity of what he'd done. After a long silence, I said, "Charlotte overheard Victoria, once, you know. She said visiting your father in the hospital was just putting in her time until the payoff." Thomas froze, his voice dropped to a whisper. "She's lying." "Charlotte doesn't lie," I said, "even when it hurts her." For a moment his face crumbled, then his phone buzzed. He glanced down, read the message, and whatever flicker of reflection I'd seen vanished. "Victoria needs me," he said flatly. "We're meeting the lawyers." He turned to go. "Thomas," I said softly, "your father's greatest regret wasn't cutting you out. It was knowing you never understood why." He didn't respond. The door closed behind him, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. That night, as I sat by the window, I whispered, "Oh, Richard, what more can I do?" Then, almost reflexively, I turned my gaze to the lights of Chicago, the silent witnesses to every twist of our family's downfall, and said quietly, "If you followed me through this far, subscribe and stay. Because tomorrow my son will finally face the truth, not the one written in his father's will, but the one written in his father's heart." Thomas showed up the next morning at 8:00 sharp, just as his message had promised. But this time he was alone. No lawyer, no Victoria, no armor of arrogance. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. The once slick businessman, always impeccably dressed, now stood before me in a wrinkled shirt tie, slightly askew, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. He looked human again. "You came," I said simply. "I said I would." His voice carried no fight, no hostility, just exhaustion. I led him into the kitchen where I had laid out a simple breakfast, scrambled eggs, sourdough toast, and coffee, Richard's weekend ritual. For years, those mornings had been sacred until Victoria declared them quaint and replaced them with champagne brunches and Instagram photos. Thomas sat staring at the meal like it was a relic from another lifetime. "You remembered," he said quietly. "Some traditions matter enough to keep," I replied. For several minutes, we ate in silence, the hum of the city below faint through the glass. Finally, he spoke. "Victoria's gone." I set my fork down, studying his face. Gone. He nodded, eyes fixed on his plate. "After our last conversation, I confronted her about what Charlotte said. She denied it at first, then accused me of betrayal. When I asked her if she'd stay if there was no inheritance, she didn't even hesitate. She packed her things within an hour. He gave a humorless laugh. 12 years of marriage and she left with 3 suitcases and your diamond bracelet. Pain rippled through me, not for Victoria but for my son. The punishment had come, but it still hurt to see him bleed. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He looked up, eyes red. "Are you?" "Yes," I whispered. "Being right doesn't make it any easier to watch someone you love lose everything." He stared into his coffee. Maybe that's what I needed, to lose everything. Then his gaze fell to the small notebook I had placed beside his plate. Richard's handwriting still clear on the cover. "Things I wish for Thomas." "What's this?" he asked. "Something your father wrote," I said quietly. "I think he wanted you to have it." He hesitated before opening it. For nearly 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the turning of pages and the occasional shaky breath. As he read, his shoulders began to tremble. When he finally looked up, tears glistened on his cheeks. "He never told me any of this," he whispered. "Would you have listened then?" I asked. He managed a sad smile. "Probably not." He closed the notebook gently, as if it were fragile. "I didn't know him at all, did I?" "You knew the father who loved you," I said. "But not the man who built something greater than himself because he wanted you to inherit more than wealth. He wanted you to inherit his values." Thomas leaned back, eyes distant. "I remember when I was 10, he murmured. Dad took me to the docks, the old one, where he started. He knew every worker by name. He told me success meant nothing if you forgot the people who made it possible." He paused, voice cracking. "I think I forgot that. I forgot him." "You can still remember," I said softly. He nodded slowly. "I'm dropping the lawsuit." For a moment I couldn't speak. "Why?" I finally asked. "Because Dad was right," he said simply. "I haven't earned it. And fighting you won't change that." He exhaled a long, trembling breath. "Victoria's gone. My reputation's a mess, and half the city thinks I'm a spoiled heir. Maybe it's time I stop running from the man he wanted me to be." Relief and sorrow crashed through me all at once. "What will you do now?" I asked. He gave a faint, uncertain smile. "Start over, I guess. Find work outside the company. Maybe try to build something on my own." Or I said gently, "You could start by rebuilding what matters most." He frowned. "You mean the company?" "No," I said softly, "Charlotte." His eyes flickered with pain. "I've been a terrible father to her." "It's never too late to change that," I replied. He hesitated. "Would you be there when I talk to her? I might not find the right words." "Of course," I said, my throat tightening. As he stood to leave, he looked around the penthouse, his gaze lingering on the photos lining the walls. Decades of birthdays, family trips, milestones frozen in time. He stopped before one in particular, a 16-year-old Thomas beside Richard on the deck of the company's flagship vessel. "I had so many chances," he said softly, "and I wasted every one." "Not everyone," I said. "You came back." He nodded, then stepped forward and kissed my forehead, something he hadn't done since he was a boy. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. When the door closed behind him, I pressed my hand over my chest and let the tears come. For the first time in months, they weren't tears of anger or loss. They were of release. A year later, we stood together at Richard's grave, just the 3 of us, Thomas, Charlotte, and me. The November air was crisp sunlight glinting off the white roses we laid against the simple granite stone. Thomas adjusted his tie, not the designer brands he once flaunted, but a modest one, befitting his new role as Community Outreach Director for the Richard Mitchell Foundation. After withdrawing the lawsuit, he had asked for no money, no title, no second chance at power, only a chance to serve. He spent the year traveling to every shipping hub Richard had built, listening to employees, meeting families, volunteering at the Foundation's scholarship programs. Slowly, humbly, he rebuilt the reputation he had once destroyed. Charlotte slipped her arm through his. "Remember that kid at last week's ceremony?" she said, smiling. "The one who said Grandpa's program was the only reason he could go to college. He couldn't stop thanking you." Thomas chuckled softly. "I just told him what I've been learning myself, that real legacy isn't money. It's the lives you touch." As we turned to leave, Thomas lingered behind for a moment, staring at the headstone. "Mom," he said finally, "I've been thinking about expanding the Foundation's scholarship program, taking it into more neighborhoods, helping kids who never even dream about college." Warmth filled my chest. "That's exactly the kind of idea your father would have loved." He smiled faintly. "Would you look over the proposal when I'm done?" "I'd be honored." We began walking back toward the car, the crunch of autumn leaves beneath our feet. For the first time in a long time, the silence between us was peaceful, not heavy. Then, out of instinct more than habit, I looked out over the golden trees and said softly, "If you followed our story until now, remember this true inheritance isn't written in wills or measured in dollars. It's written in how we live, how we forgive, and how we choose to begin again." Thomas glanced at me puzzled. "Who are you talking to, Mom?" I smiled, linking my arm through his. "Just an old woman's habit. Sometimes I like to imagine our story might help someone else find their way home." He nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful, then looked back at his father's grave. "I think it already has." As we drove away, I looked through the rearview mirror one last time at the headstone, the roses and the sunlight spilling over Lake Michigan. The choice Richard had trusted me to make had cost me nearly everything, but in the end, it gave me back my son. And that, I realized, was the legacy Richard Mitchell had always meant to leave behind. Please like, share, and subscribe. If this story touched you, because sometimes the hardest battles we fight within our families become the very stories that help others heal their own.